Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the chapter 2, part 2 of Rumah Batu's history, the anti-cession movement of 1946. On New Year's Day 1946, when Sarawak was awaiting the return of the third Brooke Raja, Sir Charles Viner Brooke from Australia, Datuk Petinggi Abang Haji Abdillah, the chief native officer as well as president of Sarawak's Malay National Association, Persatuan Kebangsaan Melayu Sarawak, PKMS, received a distressing visit from the Raja's private secretary, Mr. Gerald McBrien. In that visit, Mr. McBrien demanded that the Datu sign some letters whose contents were obscure, simply threatening that non-compliance to sign these letters would mean that the Raja would not return. To appease the Raja so that he did return to resume his sovereignty over Sarawak, the Datuk Petinggi, along with the Datuk Amar, Datuk Pahlawan, and Datuk Menteri signed the letters. With that, it was certain that the local leaders approved something which they did not fully understand, but signed to allow the Raja his return. Okay, so this is taken from Haji Muhammad Hasbi Sulaiman, pages 59 and 60. I have summed up a translation of what was going on between Datuk Petinggi Abang Haji Abdillah and GTM McBrien as related by the former in a letter to Lieutenant Colonel Gascoigne, who dealt with the general affairs of British Borneo troops in Kuching at the time. And Bujang Muhammad Noor, bin Muhammad Noor, in his book, page 30, states that the Datuk Petinggi was unable to understand the documents that he needed to sign for the return of the Raja. Okay. So just giving a little backdrop here is that we talk about perkenan. You know, perkenan is a very important issue these days. You know, when it comes to, it's a very hot issue in Malaysia now, you know. But the idea is about memperkenan the Raja back, you see. So that's the reason why they signed the letters, for memperkenan. Not necessarily to agree with what's in the letters, but to memperkenan. However, in the West, they took it to mean to agree. So there's difference. Because remember, these Datuks, they're like royalty. They need perkenan to allow the Raja to come back, you know. So there is a sort of approval in Malay culture. But so that is the context. But the Westerners would think, no, Raja's agreed to cession. Datuk has agreed to cession. Datuk has agreed to the British colonialists. No, not really. It's for perkenan. That is approval by the Malay leaders. Okay, remember the Datuk Petinggi was like a sultan, like a Raja. There's that kind of formality. So that's just a backdrop there. Okay, so that's been mentioned. They did not understand the letters because it contained information regarding the eventual cession of Sarawak to the British Crown. Furthermore, the Raja had not as yet briefed these native dignitaries on his decision. It was a decision made overseas. The Datuk Petinggi was shocked when on the 8th of February 1946, the Raja claimed that all the members of the Supreme Council had agreed with the Raja's will to surrender Sarawak over to the care of His Royal Highness, the King of Great Britain, King George VI. The Raja based this solely on the signatures that were signed to a document which were procured under false pretenses. Okay. This is again taken from Haji Muhammad Hasbi Sulaiman, pages 59 and 60. And the paragraph comes from a translation of Datuk Petinggi's actual speech to PKMS on the 10th of February 1946. Okay, so ucapan Datuk Petinggi, yeah, that he was shocked. This false procurement happened because the Datuks believed, now I'm explaining about the one thing, their consultation was important and ritualistic significant in restoring native authority to the Raja, something James Brooke understood, but not the later ones. They possibly did not understand that as much. Okay, this is based on a intuitive and sensitive understanding of native power and prowess. Okay, yeah. They read the obscure letters that were to be signed as documents that needed formal approval to restore the Brooke dynasty. This was a logical conclusion because the Raja had rebuked his absolutism over the people in a change of Sarawak's constitution on September the 24th, 1941. So you can imagine that it was in stalemate when the Japanese came. Okay, the Raja went away, it was a stalemate. Council Negeri was, the relationship between Council Negeri and the Raja was to resume from that. But 4 years of war has its impact. The constitution established the Supreme Council along with the State Council, the Council Negeri, to consult him in matters of state. The war was over, and it was thought that the Raja would be true to this amendment, okay, which was in favor of local autonomy. This is from Bujang bin Muhammad Noor, page 16. Possibly the ravages of wartime changed the Raja's understanding on whether the Sarawak people were ready for independence. It was apparent that he was not true. He changed his mind after 4 years. The 1941 constitutional amendment after the war, unknown to the Datus, he sacked his heir apparent, Raja Muda, Sir Anthony Brooke, and with him he dismissed the provisional state government that was set up to protect Sarawak during wartime while in exile. All of this happened behind closed doors. Okay, so all this happened in 1945 before he declared his intention to cede Sarawak to the British Crown. Okay, Ibid. It means the same source, page 19. The first thing the Raja did on his return to power in 1946 was to pass an order to the council to repeal the 1941 constitutional amendment. This restored all his powers to advance the cession of Sarawak to Britain at whim. Okay, like an autocrat, page 35. In the Raja's view, his authoritative decree to cede Sarawak was for the advancement and modernization of the nation. Ibid. Pure Ibid without the page means that it is exactly the same reference. The cession of Sarawak, which was inevitable come mid-1946, was tolerated by some, but was also a time in which those who were loyal to the Kingdom of Sarawak, as espoused by the Parabangan and the Brooke Raj for 1 century, was being fought for continuous for the first time in the name of Malay nationalism. In West Malaysia, you have UMNO, Semangat 46, which happened with the Malayan Union. In Sarawak, we had a parallel to that, and that was fighting the anti-cession movement. Yeah, and yeah, so there you go. Let's see. Some people found it hard to digest the change that was to come. The inhabitants of Rumah Batu and Darul Kumia were no exception. And seeing that they were abangans and that power had always favored them, cession was deemed to be the end of an important era worth protecting and saving. It was the difference between being ordinary folk and being bangsawan. Sadly, the very man who espoused the sovereignty of Brooke Raja at the time declared that these protests as a wholly undeserved romantic appeal, which has blinded the realities of the state. And had it not been for this appeal, no more public interest would attach to what is none other than a normal evolutionary change in the status of Sarawak. This is what Raja Charles Minor Brooke said in retaliation, taken therein from Malay Mail, April 14th, 1946. Hence, Sir Charles Minor Brooke showed no sensitivity to the historic relationship between the Raja and the Parabangan that lay behind the stability of Sarawak as an independent entity. In contrast, the deposed Raja Muda, Sir Anthony Brooke, son of Tuan Muda, Bertram Brooke, the grandfather of Jason Brooke, still held on to the people's hopes and joined the Malays to protest the cession of Sarawak to Great Britain. I believe Anthony Brooke was motivated to become the next White Raja should the Malays succeed in toppling Sir Charles Minor Brooke from power. Abang Haji Zawawi, my grandfather, who was at the time the chief occupant and provider for his family in Rumah Batu, decided to resign from the civil service to protest the cession of Sarawak. It seems that for the first time in Sarawak's history, the Parabangan Malays perceived a loss of status and importance. Below are comments from Abang Haji Zawawi's children, which help to characterize the condition in which they lived at this particular period of history. Okay. At the time, I did not know why we were so poor. My father became a trader, selling Qurans, religious items, as well as being a fisherman. In addition to this, other members of the family started working for other people. I remember that Rose, my stepmother, and my aunts, her sisters, had to wash other people's clothes as well as bake cakes for sale just to make ends meet in those days. I did not know the reason back then why they did this, but it seems that it was done because my father, who was a teacher in the civil service, resigned out of protest for cession of Sarawak to the British Crown, along with other relations. We were barely able to eat luxurious food items such as chicken and beef. We ate salted fish and rice most of the times. And when we could afford the luxurious foods, we ate it in small portions, maybe once a month or once a week as times were getting better for us. Only when I was 10 or 11 years old, when my father had returned to public service, were we able to have a good life. I believe this is from my father, if I'm not mistaken, Abang Ahmad Kasim bin Abang Haji Zawawi. Okay. During session, I had to dress up like a boy, help my father fish in the rivers and seas around Kuching. I needed to do this because at that time, your father was the only boy in the family, and he was far too young to be of any help to Dad. We had to go far off to sell our fish as well as trade items such as Qurans and other religious paraphernalia. And here it is, Dayang Hajalena binti Abang Haji Zawawi. The session also split the family into those who supported session and those who were against it. My grandfather was against it, but he was not on speaking terms with any of his relations who were for session, as Datin Dayang Hajalela recalls. When session was declared, after many people had left their jobs out of protest against ceding Sarawak to Britain, my father resigned from his post as a government teacher. He cut off ties with those who were for session, like his older brother, Uncle Wamoni. Here you go, Datin Dayang Hajalela binti Abang Haji Zawawi. The anti-session protests were hard on those who joined forces with the Raja Muda to salvage the dynasty's rule of Sarawak. By 1951, the anti-session was a lost cause as it gained a bad reputation for violence and was creating more socio-economic upheaval. Okay, now just to put something into context, you know that Sir Duncan Stewart worked as a governor of Palestine. Now we see Israel-Palestine have problems, and yet he was not killed there, where today if you go there, you might be killed. He was killed in Cebu. So you see how violent the anti-session had become, okay? In 1949, the governor was murdered by Rosely Doby in Cebu. And that was that showed how much passions had raged at that time. So it's quite an irony. I read a book of Sarawak's history, and Sir Duncan Stewart was in Palestine before he was murdered in Sarawak. So maybe Palestine was peaceful then, and Sarawak was not, and now it's the other way around. Okay, right. So my grandfather rejoined the civil service in that year for pragmatic reasons. He needed to leave aside his principles to help his growing family achieve a better standard of living. Education became his priority over politics, so he resumed his duty as a teacher in the public schools. Okay. Now another thing I wanted to say is that actually I know that historians like Chang Pat Fo, who said that Rosely Doby is a hero of Sarawak, but anyone who murders another person, you know, is I would not vindicate them as a hero, but you know, as part of a dark history of our times, you know. So murder is still murder. It doesn't matter in what situation. Just as a note there. The reason why the protests were filled with so much anger was due to a misunderstanding of what session meant to the people. Many, as my father and his siblings recall, were frightened of having to emigrate from a country that was being sold to Britain. Kena jual negeri. So that means so the mindset back then was that if kena jual negeri, that means we're not warga negara anymore. We all have to emigrate. I don't know where to, but It's not our land anymore. So that is the literal meaning of what jual negeri is. All right. Right. So seeing that no one could stay on a land that was sold. Kalau rumah sudah dijual, you mesti pindah rumah. So kalau jual negeri, mesti pindah negeri. So that was what they thought. But that was not what was happening. Okay. Seeing that one could not stay on land that was sold, it was an assumed fact that one could not stay in their own country should it be sold to Britain. This is from my father, Abang Ahmad Kasim, Datin Dayang Hajalela, Anjang Lelo, and Dayang Hajalena, Nahlina. Out of this simple assumption, many suffered. Yet when they saw that British colonialism had not deprived the people from their basic needs, but in fact improved their lot, many Sarawakians were willing to give up their fight against cession. Nevertheless, the one thing that slowly disintegrated hereafter was perabangan hegemony in politics. Before anti-cession, abang-abang were the number one in politics. After anti-cession, no more. It was other people as well, mixed group. Hereon, the British colonial administration, unlike the Brookes, did not discriminate when conferring datukships. Hence, datus were not exclusively perabangan. The title came with recognition of service to the Sarawak colonial government, regardless of familial or ethnic background. Somehow I wish we won. Okay, this meant that the British colonial administration brought changes to the political structure, but it also concluded an era of aristocratic styled governmental system in which the perabangan datus had enjoyed an exclusive right to sovereignty in the running of the state. The old feudal system was the backbone of Brooke, Sarawak, that had been lost as a result of British colonialism. So maybe there was something to be fighting for, but in the end, if there was no colony, there might have been no Malaysia as well. So that's something to consider. The colonial period, 1946 to 1963. Even though the perabangans as a ruling class became passé, the purpose of Rumah Batu did not diminish during the period of British rule. The building was still used as an important edifice. Furthermore, this was the period in which most of my interviewees remember as they faced the world as teenagers and young adults. Some of them were married during this period. Though in this section, we will look more into what the house was used for, okay? Come back to the main topic, and some of the lived experiences that surrounded this era. I'm very sorry I can't talk so much about the lived experiences here because of it's mainly political. As a sign that Sarawak was under colonial administration, the Duke of Edinburgh, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, came to visit the Datu's village. Now there's a picture taken of him. I'm going to just show you that picture if I may. Picture, okay. With the Chief Native Officer of the day, Datuk Bandar Abang Haji Mustafa, and in the backdrop was Rumah Batu. Batu was still seen as an important remnant of the past. The residents of this house cooperated with the local municipal council to decorate the house to honor the visit of the Duke. This was not a sign that the Perabangans were given special attention. It just happened to be one of the highlights of the Duke's trip around Kuching during his royal visit. I remember my cousin and I had to decorate our house with the Sarawak colonial flag, as well as the Union Jack hanging from the first floor over there, yeah? Veranda. It was an honor to live in the biggest house in the village. We had to make the house presentable to the Duke. I believe he passed away this year, right? Yeah, I think so. And local dignitaries who were in charge of bringing him around Kuching. He was sitting at a Malay ceremony of welcome, which was held on a stage in front of our house. Okay, so that was taken from, I believe it's my father, Abang Ahmad Kasim. The Prince of Wales, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, was escorted by Datuk Bandar Mustafa during his visit to the Datu's village while he was in Kuching in the 1950s. I was still staying at the house then. I was by the road when I saw him go past in his car. This is taken from Datin Dayang Hajalela. This is a direct translation of Datin Dang Haji Lela's recollection, and hence it might not, has been proven that it does not have historical accuracy of the royal visit. The Duke of Edinburgh was never the Prince of Wales. Okay, the Prince of Wales is actually Prince Edward, who is became King Edward VIII. So it's not the same. And he would have visited places. He visited KK, I believe, in the 1930s. Okay, and because he married a divorcee, that's the reason why his brother took over as King George VI. You can watch The Crown on Netflix to know more about that. Okay, but that is Prince of Wales, and Duke of Edinburgh is different. So there's a bit of mixture there. Now, according to Bob Rees, the picture of the Duke visit was taken in 1959. Okay, Prince of Wales had abdicated, became Duke of Windsor by then. And by that time, Prince Philip was already Duke of Edinburgh. So yet many, like Datin Dang Haji Lela, recall the event as happening when he was Prince of Wales, possibly, but that in itself is also erroneous. So that's the reason why memory and history sometimes cannot marry, because sometimes it's inaccurate what our memories are like, but the historical facts are supposed to be the ones that are based on evidence. Yeah. So here, I think, yeah, that's my dad. The house was used for many things during this era. Like the Japanese, the British found some uses for the house due to its large size. They felt that being a substantial size, Rumah Batu could provide space for civic activities on a temporary basis. There were not many new buildings that were built for such purposes during this period. Hence, the British felt that they could make do with pre-existing buildings. Remember, besides Mill Hill Block in St. Joseph's School, Rumah Batu was the only other building of a similar size. So those were the two large buildings in Kuching. No Sabakas, no Spring, no big buildings back then. So during the early 1950s, the house was used as a maternity day clinic. The central room called the Lorong, which once was used as a native court and occasionally housed important events, was where the clinic was located. Now, my father and his siblings remembered what happened during this time. We respected the fact that our house was used as a public space. It happened weekly as a maternity clinic for 2 to 3 weeks. When such things took place, we were forbidden to play in these places. Okay, this is from my dad. The house was used as a maternity clinic every Wednesday for checkups only. There were no births that took place in the house during these visits. This is from Nahlena dan Haji Lena. The house was also used as an Islamic court, as well as a place for general public health, such as giving inoculations against disease. Perhaps if COVID-19 had been a problem back then, they might have used the place for vaccinations as well. Okay, the Islamic court would try cases that were in violation with Islamic law in general, serving the Muslim community. Again, the lorong, which is the main room that you can see the window there, the front there, yeah, was used as the main area for such activities. Once more, children were to be out of sight. They were not to disturb the proceedings as they occurred in the part of the house that was open to the public. So from childhood to teenage years, my father and his siblings grew up in a house that was not merely their home, but a place that had some public importance. The period of British rule was stable, and as the years passed, the house became less important to the government. By the time Malaysia was founded as a nation on September 16, 1963, Rumah Batu was just a home that housed a great deal of people. By that time, the inhabitants had less sense of the history to which their house played a great deal in forming. The reason why they lost touch with their past was because by the time of Malaysia's formation, the British colonial experience had transformed the political landscape of Sarawak. The significance of Parabangans were lost, which is a very sad thing, yeah? All right. By the end of the colonial period, the era of Parabangan Sarawak was merely represented by the presence of Datuk Bandar Abang Haji Mustafa, the grandnephew of Patinggi Abdullah. He founded a political party called Parti Negara Sarawak Panas, which contested with other political parties in 1960. Unfortunately, as time passed, due to the British reforms in educating people from differing backgrounds, when Panas lost in the elections, Parabangan supremacy went along with it. It was the final blow. Hence, we can witness the decline of Parabangan influence from the outset of the cession of Sarawak in 1946 to the democratic contestations between the Parabangans and other Sarawakians around the time of Malaysia's formation in 1963. Conclusion. Rumah Batu was a building that faced much change during the period of 1941 to 1963. In 1941, it was a home of descendants of aristocratic Malays who shared some wealth and power in Sarawak. They got on well with the Japanese invaders as well as fought for what they believed was the right thing, such as can be seen during the anti-cession. The house was used for many activities during the colonial period, for there were not many buildings size at that time. However, if we look at the reasons for using Rumah Batu in this period as compared to the period discussed in the previous chapter, 1863 to 1941, we would notice that there was a significant shift in how the ruling parties viewed its dwellers. In 1863, Rumah Batu was home of the richest, wealthiest, and most powerful native that ever lived in Sarawak. Okay, it's like a CM's house or the Astana, similar to that. Okay, the reason why the house was a Balai Datu or Datu's court was the same reason the Astana or Brooks Palace was court for the White Rajas. Yet the reason why it became a court period covered in this chapter was due to the fact that there were just no other buildings that could do the job. It was not due to any significant political role played by the people who stayed there. The Perambangans of the 19th and 20th century were the aristocrats, bangsawan, who had led the Sarawakian community over hundreds of years of history. Yet the inhabitants of post-World War II's Rumah Batu were simply people who descended from nobility, but without the riches of a nobleman. However, the inhabitants of Rumah Batu were still compliant with the powers that ruled the land during this period of change. This is the reason why they allowed these powers to continue utilizing the house for various civic activities. The shift from aristocracy to average citizen was resultant of the ways things were beginning to change in Sarawak. The fact that Sarawak did eventually change from aristocracy to democracy over the span of 22 years was evident in how vast the family's condition was in the 19th century to how it was by the middle of the 20th century. The change from affluence to poverty and then to just making do. Even though there was a political shift, mindset and culture of those who lived in Rumah Batu at this time of change were in some ways reminiscent of the customs and traditions to which Sarawak Malays had always lived by. We will see this culture in more detail come the next chapter.